things. And it's a sign that, that science will not be out of its depth when it comes to exploring the actual inception, which I agree we can't do yet, but it certainly simplifies the problem to think that nothing has to be made, because there's nothing here now. It's just a more interesting form of nothing.
No, I mean, I mean, that's all fascinating. I mean, it is. It's genuinely interesting stuff. And I mean, I wasn't entirely unaware of it, in fact. But it doesn't really help with the basic question of, you know, why is there anything?
But it simplifies the problem.
That may be true.
Because instead of having something, what you've got is interesting nothing.
This is a lot of interesting nothing.
I think you have to open it to the floor.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, look, let me just say one thing.
Yeah.
If you were to say, look, Stephen, scientists it's sometimes been said to scientists, look, this is in principle inexplicable in any kind of naturalistic way. I mean, you know, animate things, animate matter, or you need some supernatural magic fairy dust in there to get creatures to kind of move around on their own. That's certainly not going to happen. Sure. Just chemicals jiggling, atoms and molecules jiggling of atoms void. It's in principle impossible for science to explain that. And those kind of claims have been made repeatedly, and they have repeatedly been shown to be false. So you might think that, what an arrogant twit, basically, for Stephen to stand up here and say, oh, science, it will never solve it. Well, first of all, I never said never. What I said was, first of all, no, not a crap. No. I am fairly confident, actually. I am still fairly confident because I think that there's a clear conceptual problem. There are clear conceptual problems that science actually can't help with. I think the mirror puzzle actually is a very nice example of that. And I think that there may be clear conceptual problems so far as the mind-body problem is concerned, which science won't be able to solve. We're going to have to do some conceptual engineering, or possibly we're going to have to admit that our basic conceptual framework is screwy. I mean, that might be another discovery.
I mean, that is
and that would be philosophically interesting. And I would count that
scientifically interesting.
And it would be philosophically, because you would be doing conceptual engineering to establish the conceptual screwiness of it.
In other words, you'd be following the scientist to see how
No, you're doing it, sitting in your armchair and having to think about it. That's how you would do it.
Yeah.
And it's precisely how you would do it, just like we did it with the triangles, four-sided ones, out there somewhere, let's go and have a look. No, I'm just sitting in my armchair, I know it's not worth bothering with. Yeah. And it might be that it might be that the same is true of, say, the mind. I'm not claiming this is true, I'm being modest here, right? I'm saying I don't know. That may be true of the mind-body problem, and it may be true of the problem about, why is there anything at all. I don't claim that science necessarily cannot answer it, but it does seem to me, there seems to be a huge conceptual problem there about how it could, in principle, explain why there is anything at all. And maybe ultimately that puzzle can be solved, and maybe there is ultimately some way in which science can do it. Yeah. I don't rule that out in principle, but I find it deeply, deeply baffling, and I suspect that actually you're the one that should probably be kind of reining in your ambitions a little bit here. I'm not saying don't look for it, I'm not saying don't try. Go out and do your darndest to try and answer these questions and solve these puzzles and prove me wrong, but I have a sneaking suspicion that this is one you're not going to crack.
Well, I think we'll crack it, but we might not understand it.
So I'll open this to questions from the floor now. Before we do, I just want to say, I said at the beginning of this think week that it's really very interesting when you put two atheists together and watch them disagree. We can feel that more today. I'm saying there's a great personal risk with these other speakers in front of you. That was one of the most interesting discussions I've heard for a long time. Thank you.
Since Stephen was kind enough to quote me, I ought to say, when I said there may be things that science can never solve, I added, but if science can't solve them, sure as hell nothing else can.
Yes.
So it's a pretty weak defence. I mean, I would never admit that philosophy could solve such a problem if science can't, or not necessarily. And that would apply to the origin of everything. That would apply to morality. I mean, when you say science, I agree with you, and I disagree with Peter. Science can't say what's actually right. Nothing can say what's right. You just have to make the assumption. You make the assumption that suffering is wrong or something of that sort, and then after that, you do your moral philosophy, which is just scientific logic. It's just another branch of science, in order to decide whether action X would follow from, or would have the consequence.
Am I just a scientist thing? I had
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you came on to the cat up Peter's jumper, and in a way you're saying, well, that's not science because that's just plain common sense. One could equally well say the same thing of your four-sided triangle. I mean, you don't need to be a philosopher to say there's no such thing as a four-sided triangle.
No,
it's just a matter of definition. And then the mirror problem, to solve the mirror problem, you just need to think clearly. And scientists, of course, need to think clearly. Philosophers do too, but philosophers don't have a monopoly on thinking clearly.
No,
all intellectuals think clearly.
Yes.
Yeah.
However,
well,
there are, I mean, this is where, I mean, it's not as if there's a special kind of thinking. I don't think there's a special kind of thinking that philosophers do that's really essentially different to what scientists do. But I do think that there's a certain character to certain kinds of problem, a kind of conceptual kind of entanglement or some kind of conceptual obstacle where philosophers are particularly adept, first of all, at spotting that there's even a problem there, because often the scientists will just go straight past it. They haven't even seen this problem yet. So they're very good at that. And they're also very good at then looking at how you might then solve that, what the potential solutions might be, and unpacking them. That's not to say that they can solve the problem. I suspect that certain conceptual obstacles that we hit are obstacles that are insoluble because our concepts are themselves screwy. You would have to...
Has philosophy ever solved a problem?
Well, here's one. Can you jump in the same room twice? I love that one. Heraclitus.
Yeah.
Well, it depends. You say yes. But,
Playing
I mean,
with words.
do you want to hear about it or not? I don't know.
Playing with words, etc.
Well, in a way, yes, but in a way. But look, I mean, it was a puzzle that was around for a long time. I mean, the way in which you set the puzzle up is this: you say, I mean, it's a simple puzzle, okay? But nevertheless, sometimes it's the simplest things that will you know, flummox the greatest minds for thousands of years. It's astonishing. No, but some of these things are really good. You think morality is a waste of time?
No, but I think thinking about whether you can come to the same number twice is...
No, but it's interesting. Look, it's kind of an interesting... I mean, it's often, I mean, some of the big advances in science have even come, it turns out, from people thinking philosophically. I mean, that there was a, you know...
As scientists.
No, it's got them thinking. It's got them questioning the things that they've previously taken for granted. That is one of the things that philosophy is particularly good at. That's one of the reasons why I think philosophy should be taught in schools, actually. I think it's a good thing. There's evidence that it actually makes kids smarter. There's also evidence that it makes them more morally aware, less likely to engage in the kinds of...
More interested in science.
More interested in science, yeah. So
before this gets violent.
So look, but anyway, I never even explained the thing about the jumping in the same twice. The fact is, it is a little conceptual puzzle, and you just need to be aware that there's the trading on an ambiguity in the use of the word same. But boy, people find that hard to. Once you've seen it, you go, oh God, it's so obvious. But until you've seen it, people just.
Does it make you happy?
To deal with it. Sorry?
Does it make you happy?
Well, when you get it, you kind of go, next one, you know, there's always another one.
Okay, long hair, grey t-shirt.
So I mean, fantastic. I really wanted to echo this person's words as well, first of all, and to say that I think you guys have both been intellectually fascinating and hilarious, which is so hard to get right without Stephen Fry. I was going to say, there's lots of things I want to say and try to get into the conversation, and I'm going to try to rein myself in and still get away with saying two things. The first is a statement, which I'd love to hear your views on, and the second is probably more of a direct challenge to the idea that something that maybe science can't explain or give rise to. So the statement, I should probably explain the context. I completely empathise with your point of view, Professor Atkins, because I'm a physicist, and in my first year they put me next to a philosopher. And in the first few weeks he asked me, do you think that philosophy is useful? And I said, of course it is. And then he asked why, and then we had an awkward friendship after that. But since then my views have changed a bit, and I would contend that you've possibly given a false trichotomy, is that a word? Where you've got theology, philosophy and science, and three are separate. The way that I view science now is that it's a subset of philosophy. So natural philosophy was the area of philosophy that dealt with the natural world, and that was superseded by the scientific method. And essentially any of us who call ourselves scientists or believe in the scientific method, we're essentially ascribing to a philosophical idea, which is the idea that the scientific method is the best way we have at the moment of achieving maybe not knowledge of which we're certain, but achieving any kind of knowledge, or the knowledge that we can have the most confidence in, better than anything else, better than appealing to ancient texts, and better than sitting in our armchairs and thinking about the natural world. So that's the first statement. I'd love to hear your views on that. The challenge comes from the realm of political philosophy. I think Professor Law's probably already touched on it a little bit, but I was thinking about Isabel, he wrote an essay a few decades ago. It was called Two Concepts of Freedom, so I guess this just fits into the conceptual box. He said there were two different kinds of freedom, and that question, what is freedom? Because it's a word that's used so frequently, bandied about all the time in America in particular. But he argued there were at least two different kinds, and they're mutually exclusive. So very quickly then, either freedom to do whatever I want, or say freedom from being impoverished. And I think that's a very useful distinction. I think it's a conceptual one. I'm not convinced yet that it's something that science could give rise to. And I'm done. Thank you for the time.
Well, it comes back to is it all again, doesn't it? I think the latter part of what you say. And I won't shift from my view that the analysis that such questions can be analysed scientifically, dispassionately, objectively, by going out and making observations and reflecting and talking about them. So I think that the kind of decisions that underlie sort of social polity are in fact open to scientific investigation. And I would prefer to live in a society where politics is based upon rational thought, however far back you can take the meaning of those words, than a society which was based on prejudices. I think, Stephen, you would as well, sort of evading the question in a way, I'm afraid.
I mean, so you were talking about the distinction between positive and negative liberty.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not an expert about philosophy, but I mean, it is a very... You'll have somebody over here saying, I'm for freedom, and then you'll have somebody here saying, no, I'm for freedom, I'm for liberty. And what Berlin does is he explains that there are these two very different conceptions of liberty that people operate with. And that, well, obviously, one thing that can do is create a lot of arguing across purposes. People simply don't understand each other. And so conceptual clarification then is, very valuable within the political sphere. So whenever there are these debates going on, be they scientific or political or ethical or whatever, getting some kind of conceptual clarity and also having somebody around who can spot the conceptual problems that are there that perhaps haven't been noticed yet, or getting people who can ask the more fundamental question that everyone hasn't bothered asking yet, for example, that's the kind of thing that I think philosophers do that's worth doing. I don't claim that everything that philosophers do is good. There are plenty of schools of philosophy that I consider, frankly, a waste of time. I do. Yes, believe it or not. But I do think philosophy has a role. I do think it's valuable. I don't think it has special skills of its own, but I do think that there's a kind that, when you're good, when you've had a lot of experience of dealing with certain kinds of conceptual problems, spotting certain kinds of errors in reasoning, common flaws and so on, asking the more probing question that gets behind the thing that everyone's taking about, that kind of activity is what philosophers do very well. And I think it's an important, it has an important part to play in our society. And I think it would be very sad if all the money now went to the sciences and we didn't have any philosophers anymore.